Welcome back to the Anne Boleyn case. Today in episode 2, we discuss what really triggered Anne's dislike for King Henry VIII's best mate, Charles Brandon. Ah yes, the sex craze and drunken portrayal of his character in the Showtime series The Tudors is not too far from the truth. But Anne's disgust for this man did not begin at Henry VIII's court. Oh no, it began much earlier before Anne got to the English court. It began in the Netherlands, where she was happily serving Archduchess Margaret of Austria in the 16th century. Roughly 1513 is when they first met, according to historian Hayley Nolan's book, Anne Boleyn, 500 Years of Lies. Nolan states on page 15, it was sometime around 1514 that rumors began to swirl that Anne's mistress, Marguerite of Austria, was set to marry King Henry VIII's closest companion, the infamous Charles Brandon. The couple had seen each other regularly in the autumn of 1513 at approximately the time of Anne's arrival. Historians revel in playing up the importance of the moment when Henry and Anne most likely set eyes on each other for the first time at the iconic Tudor summit that was the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. This was the first time she saw the man who would become her husband. Talk about romanticizing history. You mean this was the first time she laid eyes on the man who would murder her. But as historian Gunn confirms, Anne would have met the king many years earlier because King Henry VIII and Charles Brandon visited the court of Marguerite of Austria together during the time of Brandon and Marguerite's courtship, if we can even call it that. So realistically, this is more likely to have been the moment and the setting in which a young Anne Boleyn first saw her future killer. But what did she make of him? Was she besotted? In awe of the two men? Probably not. In fact, the events that unfolded were likely to cement Anne's lifelong disdain for the king's best friend and fuel a feud that would one day destroy her. It started when Marguerite and her ladies were summoned to celebrate the victory of her father, the Emperor, and Henry VIII at Tournai in September 1513. Drunk on high spirits and no doubt copious amounts of wine, Charles Brandon appears to have taken the game of courtly love too far. When egged on by a boisterous Henry, he proposed to Archduchess Marguerite. To confirm their engagement, and as a token of their love, Brandon then took a ring from her. But clearly feeling the joke had run its course, Marguerite was quick to ask for it back, at which point Brandon refused, no doubt thinking the whole thing was totally hilarious. But the situation soon got out of hand, as most drunken proposals tend to do. She called him a thief. People in London started taking bets on a wedding. Her father, the Emperor, was shocked to say the least, and Marguerite began threatening death to those who continued to spread the story. All in all, this was not the best first impression for Anne Boleyn to have of King Henry VIII, but it most certainly would have fixed her low opinion on Charles Brandon. End quote. If his reckless behavior wasn't enough for Anne to dislike Charles, this next piece of information would have sealed the deal for sure. Charles Brandon did not exactly like Anne either, first of all. She had been receiving all of Henry's unwanted attention during their uncomfortable courtship. Charles found himself to be less important during this time, roughly in the 1530s, according to Nolan. It seems Brandon's jealousy boiled over when he attempted to ruin the chances of Henry marrying Anne. Nolan states on pages 126 to 128 that it was a mere 6 months after Wolsey's death that Anne was hit with a devastating blow, and the first of many betrayals she was to suffer in her short lifetime. Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk at this time, gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber and lifelong companion of her husband-to-be, secretly defected to the other side in May 1530. Reports say Brandon felt increasingly sidelined by the king's affections by the new Boleyn faction. He also didn't like the way his previously high-profile princess wife, Mary Tudor, whom he had controversially married back in 1515 before he returned to England after being widowed by the King of France, and had now been seemingly outranked by the up-and-coming Anne Boleyn. Brandon was also yearning for the good old days when the king preferred his company to that of any wife or mistress. So in a desperate bid to expose Anne and get Henry to abandon all this marriage nonsense, Brandon ranked up a supposed love affair between Anne and Thomas Wyatt. Brandon was one of the men present at the infamous Game of Bowls years before, when the king had busted up with Wyatt over his flirtation with Anne. So Brandon knew there were old jealousies he could potentially play on, but as the king never seriously suspected Wyatt, Brandon's accusations had little effect. Not in 1530, at least. 6 years later, Wyatt would blame Suffolk's spiteful little story on the main reason he ended up being arrested during the conspiracy to murder Anne Boleyn. But Brandon's failure cut deep. Hurt that he had once again been ignored in favor of Anne, he disappeared from court, leading to speculation that he had been banished. But not before delivering his parting shot, urging the remaining councillors to reject an idea proposed in August or September of 1530 for Henry and Anne to go ahead with their marriage and hope the Pope would accept it once it was done. Anne's supposed reaction to Brandon's slanderous attempt to ruin her name and relationship with the king had become the stuff of Tudor infamy. Apparently, she hit back with lurid claims of Brandon having an affair with his son's 14-year-old fiancée. I'll repeat that again. She hit back with claims of Brandon having an affair with his son's 14-year-old fiancée. But that's a very diluted version of what really happened. The accusation that Nolan discovered is far more disturbing than we have ever realized. We know that Anne's opinion of Brandon was never very high to begin with, given his various indiscretions she had witnessed in her early years in France. But this accusation was no hot-headed retaliation for the events of 1530. In fact, it wasn't until over a year later, in July 1531, that Chapuis was to write in a letter that Anne wants to revenge herself on the Duke of Suffolk for having once brought a charge against her honor, and so accused him of meddling and copulating with his own daughter. Ouch. People look for who this daughter figure could have been in 1531, with some concluding, as I say, that it was Brandon's son's 14-year-old fiancée who Brandon did indeed go on to marry himself. But that can't be right, as Chapuis says it was Brandon's own daughter, which suddenly changes the accusation to one of incest. Wow. Brandon's daughter would have been 24 when Anne made this accusation. However, there is nothing in Anne's claim to indicate she was alluding to a current affair, meaning it could very well have been an unsavory suspicion she had been harboring for a long time now. I say this because there exists a little known fact, rarely brought to light, that before Anne Boleyn left Marguerite of Austria's court at the end of 1514, she had been educated alongside none other than Charles Brandon's daughter, who had been placed there at the time of his flirtation with Marguerite. His daughter is believed to have been born in 1506 or 1507, and so was either 7 or 8 years old when she joined Anne in the Netherlands, in Mechelen. We're always told the standard age to be educated abroad was 13, but in this case, there was correspondence found from Brandon recalling his daughter to England, providing she was indeed there. So, did something come to light while the girls were growing up together? Did Brandon's daughter confide in Anne? Because there is some very important detail in the wording of Anne's accusations. You see, she didn't accuse Brandon of an incestuous affair or relationship. She said he meddled and copulated with his own daughter. This does not imply consent, but abusc, which is a very serious accusation to throw at someone out of the blue a year after an argument. While everyone is quick to presume that this was Anne dishing out distasteful insults, perhaps we need to consider that there might have been something more to it. We will never know for sure, but the fact that Anne knew his daughter for some time as a child certainly sheds a whole new light on a disturbing and uneasy debate. Regrettably, what Anne wasn't to realize at the time, and what we can't fully grasp ourselves without jumping ahead to the end of her life, is that this falling out with Brandon was one day to be the final nail in her coffin. End quote. So there you have it, listeners. Anne did not radiate dislike toward Charles Brandon for no reason or strictly because he had Henry's ear and Anne saw him as a block or threat. Her anger toward him started much earlier and made more sense now. Charles couldn't stand that Anne could wisely see right through him. Well, listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. What are your thoughts on Brandon? What do you make of Nolan's sources, which I will share in the comment area below? Comment down below. Also, while you're here, go ahead and royally hit that subscribe button, like and share my podcast. And until next time, as always, keep loving history and stay curious. Bye.